And if you ask them, they will tell you they want to do better, earn more, feel better, and achieve more. But wanting something and deciding to do what is required to have it are two entirely different conditions, and most people never stop long enough to notice the gap between the two. You see, interest is a fascinating thing because it feels like movement even when nothing is happening. A person can be interested in improving their life for years and never make any meaningful change, because interest does not require action. It only requires agreement. It allows someone to say, "Yes, that sounds good," or "Yes, I would like that," without ever rearranging their schedule, their habits, or their priorities to match that desire. Interest is comfortable because it does not demand payment. Commitment, on the other hand, is where everything begins to change. Because commitment requires a decision that has consequences. When a person becomes committed, they are no longer negotiating with themselves about whether they will act. They have already decided, and now the only question is how they will follow through. Commitment does not ask, "Do I feel like it today?" It asks, "What must be done today?" and then expects an answer in the form of action. Now, here is where many people quietly fall behind without realizing it, because they mistake strong interest for commitment. They feel enthusiastic when they hear a good idea. They feel motivated when they read something inspiring, and they feel encouraged when they imagine a better future. But when conditions become difficult, when progress is slow, or when effort is required without immediate reward, that interest begins to fade. It was never designed to carry them through difficulty, because interest depends on favorable conditions to stay alive. Commitment is different because it does not depend on how things feel. A committed person may not feel excited every day, but they continue anyway. They may not feel confident at every step, but they continue anyway. They may not see immediate results, but they continue anyway. That is the defining trait of commitment. It continues when interest would have already disappeared. It is not emotional, it is structural, and it holds a person steady when everything around them becomes uncertain. If you want to understand why some people move ahead while others remain in the same place, you must look at the moment where a person stops hoping for improvement and starts deciding to create it. Hope is important, but it is not enough. Desire is useful, but it is not enough. There must come a point where a person draws a line and says, "This is no longer something I would like to happen. This is something I am going to make happen." And from that point forward, their behavior begins to change. You can always tell the difference between interest and commitment by looking at a person's daily life. Commitment shows up in how someone spends their time, how they handle discomfort, what they are willing to give up, and how consistent they are when no one is watching. It reveals itself in small decisions repeated over and over again, not in occasional bursts of effort. Interest talks about change, but commitment organizes life around it. Life has a way of making this distinction very clear over time. Someone who is interested will start and stop, begin and delay, promise and postpone, because their actions are tied to how they feel in the moment. Someone who is committed will continue, adjust, and persist, because their actions are tied to a decision they have already made. One drifts with conditions, while the other directs their course regardless of conditions. And here's what I've learned. Progress is not an accident. It is not something that happens randomly to a few fortunate people while everyone else waits their turn. Progress is the natural result of a certain kind of decision, followed by a certain kind of behavior, repeated long enough to produce results. It begins the moment a person stops treating improvement as an idea and starts treating it as a responsibility. You do not move ahead because you wish harder than someone else. You do not move ahead because you think about it more often than someone else. You move ahead because at some point you decided more firmly than someone else, and then you backed that decision with action that continued beyond the moment of enthusiasm. That is the dividing line. And it is not as wide as people think, but it is as decisive as anything you will ever encounter. So the question is not whether you are interested in a better life, because almost everyone is. The real question is whether you have made a decision that shows up in your daily behavior, your schedule, your priorities, and your consistency. Because once that decision is made, and once it is honored day after day, progress is no longer a mystery. It becomes a predictable outcome of the way you choose to live. But here's what else will decide whether or not someone moves ahead: how they handle responsibility. This subject is not always comfortable, but it is one of the most powerful turning points in a person's life. Because everything begins to change the moment someone accepts that they are responsible for their direction, regardless of their circumstances. It is easy to explain why life is difficult. Anyone can point to conditions, to setbacks, to unfair situations, or to things that did not go according to plan. Those explanations may even be accurate, and in many cases they are. But there is a difference between understanding why something happened and using that understanding to build a better path forward. One explains the past, while the other begins to shape the future. Many people spend years becoming very skilled at explaining their situation. They can tell you what went wrong, who was involved, what was missing, and why it was difficult for them. But while they are becoming more detailed in their explanations, they are not becoming more effective in their actions. Explanation without responsibility does not produce change. It simply makes the current situation more understandable without making it any better. The people who move ahead make a different shift. They begin asking better questions, and those questions change everything. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" they begin asking, "What can I do about this?" Instead of asking, "Who is at fault?" they begin asking, "What can I improve?" Instead of asking, "Why is this so difficult?" they begin asking, "What must I learn to handle this better?" These questions may sound simple, but they redirect the mind toward action. Responsibility is not about assigning blame to yourself for everything that has ever happened. It is about recognizing that your response to what has happened is within your control. A person cannot always choose their starting point, but they can choose their next step. They cannot always control the circumstances they face, but they can control how they respond to those circumstances, and that response begins to shape what happens next. Now consider what happens when a person refuses responsibility. They may feel justified in the moment because placing blame elsewhere can protect their sense of self. It can make them feel less at fault, less accountable, and less pressured to change. But over time, that habit begins to weaken them because it removes their ability to act. If the cause of the problem is always outside of them, then the solution must also be outside of them, and that leaves them waiting. Waiting is one of the most costly positions a person can take, because while they are waiting for something to change, nothing within them is improving. Their skills are not increasing, their discipline is not strengthening, and their understanding is not expanding. They remain in the same position, not because they lack potential, but because they have not taken ownership of what they can influence. Those who move ahead understand that responsibility is not a burden, it is an advantage. It gives them something to work with. It allows them to take action even when conditions are not ideal. It provides a starting point no matter how small, and from that starting point, progress can begin to build. Responsibility turns a person from a spectator into a participant, and that change alone can alter the course of a life. There's also something else that happens when a person accepts responsibility, and that is they begin to see opportunities where others only see obstacles. When the focus is on blame, every difficulty looks like a barrier. But when the focus is on responsibility, every difficulty becomes something to study, something to work through, and something to learn from. The same situation that stops one person becomes a training ground for another. It is important to understand that excuses, while they may provide temporary comfort, carry a long-term cost. An excuse allows a person to step away from effort in the moment, but it also steps them away from growth. Each time an excuse is accepted, the habit becomes stronger, and over time, it becomes the default response to challenge. That pattern does not just delay progress, it prevents it. The people who move ahead develop a different habit. When something does not go well, they do not spend their time protecting their position. They spend their time improving it. They look at what happened. They look at what they could have done differently, and they make adjustments. This process may not always be easy, but it is effective because it keeps them moving forward instead of standing still. And here is the key point. Growth begins when ownership begins. The moment a person says, "This is my responsibility," they gain the ability to act. They gain the ability to improve, to learn, and to change direction. Without that ownership, even the best ideas remain unused because there is no one taking charge of applying them. So if you are trying to understand why some people move ahead while others do not, look closely at how they respond when things are not ideal. Do they search for reasons, or do they search for solutions? Do they wait for change, or do they begin creating it? Because the answer to those questions will tell you whether they are standing still or beginning to move forward. But there is another factor that plays a decisive role in who moves ahead and who does not, and that is how a person uses their time. This is one of those things that everyone understands in theory, but very few people apply with discipline in practice. Time is one of the few resources given equally to everyone, yet the results people produce with it are remarkably different. And the reason lies not in how much time they have, but in how they choose to use it. Every person receives the same number of hours in a day, but those hours do not produce the same outcomes for everyone. Now, why is that? You give one person time, and it becomes a tool for building, improving, and progressing. Give it to another, it becomes something that passes without much thought, something that is spent rather than invested. The difference between those two approaches, repeated day after day, is what eventually creates a gap in results that can no longer be ignored. One of the most common mistakes people make is underestimating the value of small amounts of time. They believe that meaningful progress requires long stretches of perfect conditions, and when those conditions are not available, they postpone action. They wait for a better moment, a quieter schedule, or a time when everything feels more convenient. But while they are waiting, time continues to pass and nothing is being built. The people who move ahead think differently about this. They understand that progress is often constructed in small segments, not just in large blocks. They learn to use the spare moments, the overlooked hours, and the time that others might consider insignificant. They recognize that a few focused efforts, repeated consistently, can produce far more than occasional bursts of activity, followed by long periods of inactivity. Another important distinction is how people treat delay. Many assume that postponing action is harmless, especially if they intend to return to it later. But delay carries a cost that is not always immediately visible. When action is delayed, progress does not begin. And if progress does not begin, it cannot build. What could have started growing remains at zero, and that lost time cannot be recovered. Failure, while uncomfortable, at least produces experience. It teaches, it refines, and it provides information that can be used for improvement. But delay produces none of these things. It simply keeps a person in the same place, with the same level of understanding, and the same set of results. In many cases, postponement is more damaging than a mistake because it prevents even the possibility of progress. Those who move ahead understand that waiting until they feel completely ready is often a mistake. Readiness is not something that always arrives before action. In many cases, it develops during action. A person becomes more capable by doing, not by waiting to feel capable. They begin before everything is perfect, and as they move forward, they adjust, learn, and improve along the way. There is also a level of respect that successful people develop for their days. They do not treat time casually because they understand that each day represents an opportunity that will not return. Once a day has passed, it cannot be retrieved, and whatever was not done remains undone. This awareness does not create pressure, it creates intention. It encourages a person to use their time in a way that aligns with what they are trying to build. Now, this does not mean that every moment must be filled with effort, or that rest has no place in a productive life. Rest is necessary, and it serves a purpose. But there is a difference between rest and neglect. Rest is planned and intentional, while neglect is unplanned and often unnoticed. One restores energy, while the other quietly wastes opportunity. Understanding that difference is essential for anyone who wants to make better use of their time. People who move ahead also tend to have a clear relationship with what matters and what does not. They become more selective about where their time goes. They begin to recognize that not all activities carry the same value, and that some choices, while easy, do not contribute to their progress. Over time, they shift their attention toward what produces results, and away from what simply fills time without building anything. And here is the key point. Progress is not built on what a person intends to do someday. It is built on what gets done repeatedly, day after day. Plans can be useful, but they are only valuable when they lead to action. Ideas can be powerful, but they only create change when they are applied. Time becomes productive not when it is planned, but when it is used. So if you want to understand why some people move ahead while others remain in the same place, look at how they treat their time. Do they wait for the right moment, or do they begin with the moment they have? Do they postpone action, or do they take small steps consistently? Because over time, those choices accumulate, and they shape the direction of a person's life in a way that is both predictable and unavoidable. But time alone does not explain everything, because what a person does with that time matters just as much. You know, what skills do they choose to build, and how seriously do they take the process of becoming more valuable? This is where personal development moves out of theory and into something practical, because progress in life is closely tied to the value a person can offer to others through their abilities. It is important to understand that effort by itself is not enough. Many people work hard, but they do not see the results they expect. And the reason is not a lack of effort. It is a lack of direction in how that effort is applied. Effort must be connected to improvement, and improvement must be connected to usefulness. Without that connection, a person may stay busy, but they will not necessarily move ahead. The world tends to respond to value.